Good morning to you. Thank you. Okay, everybody, good to see you. And we're now continuing with the Maamar. Let's get the proper chapter here. Okay. Good. Before we begin chapter number 4, to recap what we spoke until now. Number 1 is that the meaning of shofar. Shofar, says the Rebbe, in the name of the Tzemach Tzedek, means tainug, means pleasure. And therefore, by blowing the shofar, we create a pleasure in heaven. And then God now desires to come down to this world and brings that pleasure into creation. Number 2, we ask the question, why is it that Rosh Hashanah, that falls out on Shabbos, we don't blow the shofar? And we answer it because Shabbos itself is a day of tainug, a day of pleasure, and therefore that day itself of Shabbos incorporates tainug into the world, just as if one would actually blow the shofar. However, we still have a question, how come in the Beis HaMikdash they blew the shofar when Shabbos fell out on Rosh Hashanah? If Shabbos itself is a day of pleasure, a day of tainug, why then do we need to blow the shofar in the Beis HaMikdash? Okay, before we start chapter number 4, please make sure you give tzedakah, especially we find ourselves now in the 3 weeks. And you know that Tzion, B'mishpat, Tipada, B'shaveh, B'tzedakah, that Zion will be redeemed through the study of Torah and through the giving of charity. So we begin with charity, tzedakah, into your pushka. Okay, I just did. Hope you could do the same at home. Here we go. We now continue chapter number 4. In addition to the fact that through the blowing of the shofar, we create a tainug, we create a pleasure above the zah, in the supernal levels of zah, which are the supernal midos, the supernal attributes of emotions. Ma shalamayla, he mimach, as we explained many times in the name of the Maggid, that a person should know what happens in the higher world is a reflection of you. And by you being happy, you create happiness in the higher world. By you being sad, you create sadness. By doing mitzvahs and acts of goodness and kindness, you create and develop a new aura of positive energy in the universe. It's all dependent upon you. And therefore, similarly, through the blowing of the shofar, one draws down the pleasure. The shofar, which is the quality of the shofar, in the entire world. And not only this physical world, but all the worlds, all the higher worlds of Atzilus and Bria and Yetzirah and Asiya, all of these worlds are now incorporated with this manifestation of this light of pleasure. Ad ba'il Masiyah, until it reaches this final world down here, the world of action. As we say in the Machzor, we say in the Musaf service, on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, what do we say? We say there are 3 special blessings that we say in the Amidah of Rosh Hashanah: Malchus, Sechrenis, and Shofar. Malchus is that we incarnate God as King, number 1. Number 2 is we ask God to remember our commitment to Him, our love to Him. And then the Shofar is the blowing of the Shofar. What does that mean? What's the purpose behind this? So in the actual prayers we begin by saying, God, remember that you created everything, you formed everything, and anyone that has a soul in their nostrils praises you on this day. Let's see it inside. As we say in the praise of Rosh Hashanah, we say that every creation knows that you are the one that created it, and every formation knows that you formed it. And anyone that has a soul in his nostrils praises you and calls you king. Isa b'Siddur Arizal explains in the Siddur of the Arizal. The Gimel L'Shein is able of these three terminologies. Koyal Gimel Elam is Bia, go on the three worlds of Bia, Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya. Shama Biapoi, anyone that has a soul in his nostril goes on the world of Bria, the world of creation, which is the highest of the three worlds. And Yatsur, Elam Yitzir. And the word Yitzur means formation, alludes to the world of Yitzira, which is the world of formation. Well, Ba'ilam Hasiyan, all of your creations allude to the world of action where you actually made the physical world and the physical beings. Shehem Klos which is the general concept of the three worlds. And therefore, by saying and acknowledging God, you are bringing down this pleasure of the blowing of the shofar, not only into the higher worlds of Zah, but also into the lower worlds of Bria, creation, and Yitzira, and formation, and the world of Asiya, the world of action. And that's why we say these three terminologies. It's not simply poetry. It's not that it simply sounds good, but every word in the prayers is based on the secrets of Kabbalah, is based on the secrets of the higher worlds. As we know that this new flow of energy that comes down in Rosh Hashanah effectuates all the worlds, including this physical world down here. And therefore, that is the reason why we don't blow the shofar when Rosh Hashanah falls out on the Shabbos, because Shabbos itself is tainu, Shabbos itself is pleasure, and this causes the flow of pleasure to manifest itself in all of the worlds on its own because of Shabbos, without the blowing of the shofar. As is known, the Shabbos, in general, Shabbos itself also affects all the worlds. In other words, the reason that we have Shabbos down here in this world is because there's Shabbos in the higher worlds. And Shabbos affects also the world of action. Before become Drushim, as explained in many different Maamarim, and many of them in the Lord and the Maamarim, that the vitality of all the worlds, including this physical world, the Shabbos, on Shabbos, is truly elevated. Even the energy that manifests this physical finite world on Shabbos is a different energy than the 6 days of the week. For example, throughout the 6 days of the week, is the vitality of that week, of the day, the Olamois, the creation of the worlds. And the vitality and the energy of the worlds, this world and the higher worlds, are from the Dibur, which is the speech of God, God's words, the 10 utterances of creation. As we say in the chapter 5 of Ethics of Our Fathers, God created the world with 10 utterances of speech. And similarly, if you look into the book of Genesis in chapter 1, it talks about all of these sayings, Vayomer, and God said, let there be light, etc., etc. So therefore, those letters, as we explained many times, are actually in the heavens that continue to vitalize the world every moment anew, as Baal Shem Tov teaches us. That every moment the world is being recreated by those 10 utterances of dibur, of speech. However, in contrast, the Shabbos, the vitality of the world, listen to this. On Shabbos, the world receives its nourishment. On Shabbos, the world receives its vitality from the letters of God's thought, not from the letters of God's speech. Just like each one of us, when we think something, we are thinking through letters, even though we are not conscious of it. But in the subconscious, the words and the thoughts that we produce and create and meditate upon are letters of thought. So you say to yourself, I want to go do this, I want to go do that, or I like this, I like that, or this is an amazing concept. This is oisius machshava. These are letters of thought. When God created the world, he created the world through speech. But on Shabbos, you're not allowed to create. Just like God commands us, we are not allowed to create on Shabbos. Being that God's creation is through his speech, and we know that what it says, when you talk, it's like you are doing action. God does not create the world through speech on Shabbos. How does God create the world on Shabbos? Through the letters of thought. And therefore, the entire world is transformed on Shabbos. The entire world is elevated on Shabbos. It's a different energy. And by the way, that is the reason why Sunday we say today is the first day of the week. It starts all over again, back into the world of speech. And therefore, even though we have 365 days of the year, 30 days every month, every week is 7 days. Why? Because Shabbos, the world becomes elevated. Sunday is day one again. Starts all over. So now we say that this concept of oisius hamachshava, these letters of thought, the Shabbos on Shabbos, these letters of thought manifest itself in all the worlds. Even the physical world, which is physical in contrast to letters of thought, these letters of thought now vitalize this physical world. To the degree that this also impacts the nature of even an ignoramus, as the Rambam says, and the Gemara says, that on Shabbos, even an amaris, an ignoramus, the Shabbos harei mitzativoi eine yochel l'shakel. An ignoramus on Shabbos cannot lie, cannot say a lie. Shabbos is so powerful that it impacts the entire world, that even one who is ignoramus, who's debased, who does not have the knowledge of Torah and mitzvahs, that person on Shabbos will not even say a lie. Why? Because the whole world is elevated on Shabbos to the letters of God's thoughts. You see, Shabbos itself, reality is a different energy. This is the energy that now impacts the world on Rosh Hashanah when it falls out on a Shabbos. Therefore, when Rosh Hashanah falls out on a Shabbos, we don't have to blow the shofar, because Shabbos itself is elevated and it has this pleasure. As we said many times, Shabbos is called pleasure. And therefore, the entire world now receives this new light through Shabbos. So now we have a question: if that's the case, why then don't we blow the shofar in the base? Why do we blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash? If Shabbos is so powerful and it brings tainu, pleasure to the entire world, why must we blow the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash? And the fact that in the Holy Temple they blew the shofar even on Shabbos. It's because of the fact that the blowing of the shofar in the Beis Hamikdash is much higher. In other words, ותיינוק שיש בשבת מצד עצמוי מצד שבת מקדש וקיים כן בשנה שלך בשבת אין תגן דין שהגעת כי שפר במקדש ממשיכים בחינס תיינוק ישראל ינאל is. Here says the Rebbe that even though we don't blow the shofar on Shabbos, when Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, that is true only in Medina, in the country, but not in the temple. Why? Because in the temple we have the capacity, we have the potential to elicit a greater level of pleasure, a level of pleasure beyond Shabbos. And because the temple is a holy place and a godly place, where God, Shekhinah rests there, God manifests there, it has there the tools. And it is hardwired in a way that it can produce a higher frequency, a higher level of tainug, a higher level of pleasure. That cannot be incorporated into the world because of Shabbos itself. As we know, as we explained earlier, that on Shabbos there are two levels. There's a level of Shabbos that is pleasure on its own. Shabbos itself, it's a day of pleasure. And then there's the mitzvah that every one of us has to bring pleasure into the Shabbos, that we can add to the pleasure of Shabbos. But even the pleasure that we are adding to the Shabbos is limited. It has its limitations. It has its ceiling. It has its restrictions. But in the Beis Hamikdash, you're able to access a higher level of tainug, a higher level of pleasure. And therefore we blew shofar in the Beis Hamikdash. This level of pleasure is higher than the pleasure that we bring into Shabbos. And this can be accomplished only on Rosh Hashanah and only through the blowing of the shofar. What does that mean? What is this concept of tainug? What is this concept of pleasure that is produced through the blowing of the shofar? To understand this, we need to go into chapter number 5. And the concept is as follows. כיוון שהרצון הוא שווה בכל המצווה, ומילא גם התענוג שמצד הרצון בכל שווה באופן הבא, הוא התענוג הפרטי שבכל מצווה, שבכל מצווה יש תענוג מיוחד. Says the Rebbe like this. We can understand this through a parable or analyzing the mitzvahs. There are 613 commandments. To each commandment, there are two levels. There is the ratzon, there is the will of God, that we fulfill the commandment and that we fulfill all the commandments. And that will, that ratzon is equal for all 630 commandments of the Torah. There's no difference. It's like a mother asking her child, clean your room. And the child cleans the room, it brings pleasure to the mother. Or the mother says, do me a favor, please make me a coffee. The same ratzon, the same will, is for making me the coffee, and the same will is cleaning the room. And that is, I want you to listen to what I am requesting of you. I need you to fulfill my will, to validate my will. It makes no difference if it's a cup of coffee or cleaning the room. If you validate my will, great. If you don't, you violated my will. And that hurts. But this is a ratzon, this is a will that is true for all mitzvahs. Then there's a level of will that is individualized and tailored per each mitzvah. Each mitzvah has a different specific pleasure, a different side effect. And therefore, this level of pleasure is higher depending on the mitzvah. One is higher than the other. One is different than the other. It creates a different atmosphere, it creates a different energy. It creates a different taste in the world. It creates a different excitement, a different pleasure. Every mitzvah has its unique pleasure. It's like each food. On one hand, you need food to survive. It makes no difference if it's pizza, or it's gefilte fish, or it's chopped herring, or chopped liver. It makes no difference. I need to survive. So that's one level. I need to live. I need food. And then, whoa, this food is delicious. It tastes so amazing. And the other food, that's also delicious. It also tastes amazing. Hello, I gave you two different foods. How can they both be amazing? Well, they're both amazing and they're both different. Which one do you like better? I don't know. Do you like the chopped herring? Do you like the chopped liver? I don't know. They're both great. Just make sure you don't eat fish and meat together. That's a Jewish law. We don't mix fish and meat. It's not like fish. It's not like milk and meat, which you have to wait a few hours in between eating meat before you can eat milk. Here, simply we say out of danger, one should not eat fish and meat together. You don't put it on the same plate. You eat your fish, and you have a little piece of challah or bread in between, and a little water, or even better, a shot of single malt. And then after that, you have a piece of meat, or you chop the herring, or you chop liver. So there's two levels of tainug, there's two levels of pleasure. The level of pleasure, that is a general level for all mitzvahs. God said, do my will, and thank you, you validate me. Then there's a higher level of pleasure, and each mitzvah is different depending on the mitzvah. That tainug aprati shebachol mitzvah daily yesem at tainug shebsaradatzein shebeshava b'chol mitzvahs. There's a chidush b'drush zeh. Says the Rebbe that the pleasure that God derives from the individual desire of that specific mitzvah is a higher pleasure than the general pleasure that God derives from the mitzvah in general. So all the mitzvahs in general create pleasure for God. But the individual mitzvah, the individual pleasure that God derives from this mitzvah over the other mitzvah is a greater level of pleasure. Again, you can understand it as we gave the example with food. I have pleasure to eat food because it gives me sustenance. But then this food over that food, when I begin to compare each one, it gives me a greater delight, a greater level of tainug, a greater level of pleasure. And the Rebbe says this is the novelty of this teaching of the Tzemach Tzedek, that the individual pleasure of the mitzvah is higher than the general pleasure of the mitzvah. In general, it's discussed in Kabbalah and Chassidus that the meditation, the individual meditation of the mitzvah is generally lower than the general meditation of the mitzvah, which is doing God's will. In other words, a moment ago we spoke about the pleasure of the mitzvah. Now we're talking about the meditation of the mitzvah. When you meditate, I'm doing a mitzvah. There's two levels of meditation. Number one is I'm doing God's will. It doesn't matter what God's will is, I am fulfilling his will. Then there is a meditation. I'm doing this mitzvah of lighting the Shabbos candles. I'm doing this mitzvah of tefillin, and therefore it has a unique energy. It creates a new manifestation of godliness in the world. And this kavanah, generally we say, is not as great or as important as the general kavanah, as a general meditation, which is I'm meditating that I'm doing God's will, that a mortal being is now connecting with God, which is the meaning of mitzvah. Mitzvah not only means commandment, but it means connection. That mere connection, that a human finite being can connect with the infinite God, is the ultimate kavanah, is the ultimate meditation of the mitzvah. Wow, I became infinite right now. I am mortal, I am finite. How do I become infinite? By doing a mitzvah. It's very simple. It's a simple tool. And then I can ponder and meditate upon the individual mitzvah, what I'm doing, and how this effectuates different realities within the realms of creation. However, here says the Rebbe, it's a Tzedek, tells us a new novelty, that the pleasure that God derives is actually greater from the individual mitzvah over the general mitzvah. Shubishava b'chol mitzvah subichinas gilya tainug. Shaking tainug aprati b'chol mitzvah. Shorshoi hu mebechinas mokre tainugim. Maila mebechinas gilya tainug. Here he says that the pleasure that God derives from the mitzvahs in general is called gilui hatainug. It is called the revelation of pleasure. In contrast to the individual mitzvah, we now reveal the source of all pleasure, which is higher than the revelation of pleasure. We'll soon expound on this. And now that we reach the source of all pleasures, now through doing the individual mitzvah, the particular mitzvah, we access this particular pleasure from the source of all pleasure that now manifests itself in this unique mitzvah. And through this, Tzemach Tzedek explains the concept of shofar, that shofar represents pleasure. And it says, I know you're saying, Imri Shefer, one who delivers words of pleasure, words of praise. Kama pratim dafke, kumoikein, ubetainuk shakol, ukumoikein, ubetainuk shabikoil, nigunuk lizemer, shudafke chiesh, harkava jo kama koilis. Bachivan the shever who koilecha, ich shaykh, shia betainuk. So comes the question to mind. We just said that the tainug, the pleasure of an individual mitzvah, is higher because it comes from the source of all pleasure. Now we can understand the concept of the shofar. The shofar represents tainug, pleasure, and it's the source of all pleasure. Because in reality, if you think about it, on one hand, the shofar makes no sense. Why would the shofar itself bring you pleasure? What is pleasure? When you hear one instrument, the pleasure is when you hear an orchestra with many instruments and many levels of harmony. Then you have pleasure. One instrument alone is not really so much pleasure, especially the blowing of the shofar is not a phenomenal instrument. So why is this something which derives and actually causes God to reveal the ultimate level of pleasure? And same is true with tainug itself. Pleasure itself is usually when there are many details to the pleasure, like a picture, a beautiful work of art, one piece of paper or one canvas that has one color, all black, is not so great. But if it has black and red and blue and a mixture of colors, now it creates forms. Now it's beautiful. So why is one voice, one coil of the blowing of the shofar considered to be the source of all pleasure? Furthermore, we see the koil shofar in Beit Tainug, there is really no pleasure in the blowing of the shofar. On the contrary, it creates a dread, creates a fear. When you hear the blowing of the shofar, you begin to tremble. It says, if you will blow a shofar in the city, will the people not tremble? Similarly, by the beginning of the Torah on Sinai, the blowing of the shofar was very strong. The entire people trembled. That was in the camp. And says the people saw, and they stood from the distance. They went afar because they were afraid of this blowing of the shofar that took place on Sinai. Because of the fact that there was such a great revelation of God. And the thing of the shofar on Sinai was so overwhelming that they trembled. And because of this, they were overwhelmed and they became totally nullified. And because of this, they ran away. They stood from the distance. And this idea of trembling and self-nullification is truly the opposite of pleasure. And we say the shofar truly represents pleasure. The answer is because shofar comes from the source of pleasure. The source of pleasure is not manifested in our everyday understanding of pleasure. And that's why you don't find in the blowing of the shofar any true feelings of pleasure. On the contrary, it's the opposite. it creates fear. Because it's higher than the revealed pleasure. Revealed pleasure, you can see the pleasure and you can feel it. However, this pleasure of shofar is not revealed. It's the source of pleasure, which is not yet revealed, which is higher than the revelation. As we'll soon explain. Rather, it's the source. However, from the source is now drawn down and delineated all the individual pleasures. And that's why shofar also means to shapru masechem, to fix and beautify your actions. Masechem lashon abim, your actions in plural. Because through the blowing of the shofar, it effectuates and impacts every one of your actions and every one of your beautifying the actions and the pleasure of the actions. Because even though we are tapping into the source of pleasure, it has the ability, it has the capacity to now direct its pleasure into the individual mitzvah and create a unique pleasure for that mitzvah. Zui gamkin hashayach is the shofar, and that's also the connection between the blowing of the shofar and the giving of the Torah on Sinai. As we know, the blowing of the shofar was also at Sinai. As we say in the Muslim service of Rosh Hashanah, that you, God, you revealed yourself on Sinai, to teach to your nation Torah mitzvahs, and you came down and revealed yourself through the blowing of the shofar. And we know that at Matan Torah, beginning of the Torah, God revealed his essence. And no nafshi as it says, my essence I put into the Torah. In other words, God's essence represents the source of all pleasure, which is higher than revelation. And then, after the first statement, I am God your Lord, which is not one of the 10 commandments, which is the essence, it's the introduction, is God coming down on the mountain, God putting his essence into the words of Torah. He now begins to elaborate and enumerate the 10 commandments in that Surah Maamaris. Every single word of these 10 commandments was now totally permeated and pervaded with this pleasure that came from the source of pleasure. But now it becomes revealed. Now you're able to feel the pleasure. You're able to benefit from this pleasure. And that is why it says for every one of the 10 commandments, their souls left their body. Why did the soul leave their body? Because they sensed this level of pleasure. Here, by the way, you see the approach of Chassidus, the beauty of Chassidus. In the Gemara, it says, in the Talmud, it says they died when God spoke the commandments because it was too powerful, overwhelming. The human body cannot handle so much noise, so much pressure, such revelation. They died. Chassidus comes along and explains it on a much more refined level. It was because of the pleasure of each of these words. When they heard God speak, they heard the sweetness, the pleasure, the excitement, the vitality, the love that God manifested in each one of these words. They said to themselves, wow, this is unbelievable. How can I remain here in this finite world? I want to leave the world. I want to connect with this unbelievable power of sweetness, this pleasure, this love. This is unbelievable. I never sensed such a level of pleasure in my life. And the soul simply left the body. God resurrected him. He said the next commandment, the second commandment, After saying the second commandment, again, they left their body. Why? Because they sense this tainug, they sense this pleasure, which came from the source of pleasure. But over there in the source of pleasure, you don't really understand. It's beyond your tools. You cannot access it. You cannot taste it. It's beyond your taste buds. But when it's now manifested into each one of the 10 commandments, now you feel the tainug. Now you feel the pleasure. And each one has a unique taste. One is vanilla ice cream, one is chocolate ice cream, one is strawberry ice cream, one is mocha ice cream, one is mint ice cream. Each one has a different taste, a different pleasure. And then it continues, the pleasure continues to go more and more into the 613 commandments. The Lamed La'amcha Torah and mitzvahs to teach your nation all the Torah and all the mitzvahs, all the Torah and all the explanations. Each one individually. Okay, we're going to stop over here. The end of chapter A. Just to recap and summarize, we spoke that there are many levels of tainug, many levels of pleasure. There's the revealed pleasure and the concealed pleasure. Revealed pleasure is the general pleasure of doing a mitzvah. And then there is the actual pleasure, the source of pleasure, which is revealed when a person does a particular mitzvah. And this explains the fact that even though Shabbos itself is a day of pleasure, why it's not enough for Shabbos when it falls out on Rosh Hashanah for us not to blow the shofar, but rather in the Beis Hamikdash we do blow the shofar because we have the capacity in the Beis Hamikdash to access a higher level of tainug, the level of makar hatainug, the level of the source of all pleasure. And this is also expressed in the 10 Commandments. The first of the 10 Commandments is I am God your Lord. That's the essence. And now it becomes expressed and manifest in the 10 Commandments. But it is the level of makar hatainug. It comes from the source of pleasure. And therefore the pleasure is much more manifest and much more pleasurable than the average pleasure, than the lower pleasure. In truth, every day we can access and get a sense of this when we do a mitzvah. When you do a mitzvah and you meditate, number one, I'm doing this mitzvah because God told me, we access the lower level of tainug. And then when I do the mitzvah in particular, and I'm able to access this individual light, and I see the side effects, the spiritual side effects, I now have the power, like the blowing of the shofar in the Holy Temple, on Rosh Hashanah, the falls on Shabbos, to manifest and to access this higher level of pleasure. We're going to talk about it in greater detail in chapter number 6 next week. In the meantime, are there any questions? I'm happy to, with God's help, to speak about it. Any questions, Kevin? Any questions? Okay. Go out in the world and conquer the world and manifest and access, suck out all the pleasure in the world. God gave you a lot of pleasure. There's a lot of pleasure there. It's our job to access that and to connect with it. And by doing so, we create more pleasure in heaven, which rebounds back down to the world, even more pleasure. All right, have a pleasurable day, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, wonderful.
Rabbi. Have an amazing day. God bless you.
Great day.
Mm-hmm.